Now that the application is running in IAS, we want to hook up the database. So the first thing I'm going to do is come back into the Ode to Food project, comment out the line where we said use in-memory restaurant data, and re-add the line of code that says, yes, please use the real SQL restaurant data service. So now, before our application can execute successfully, we're going to need a working database. To get a working database, I'm going to do this in 2 steps. The first step you might think of as, how do I create this database? How do I get it started? Well, you might remember from earlier in the course, we would use .NET migrations to create a database. That might be something that you don't do in production because you're just not going to be able to connect to a production database and run the .NET command to execute migrations against that production database. So what you might do instead, as I flip over into the data directory for this application, is I might do a .NET EF migrations script. Remember, we talked about this command earlier in the course. I want to generate a script for all of the migrations that are there, and I want to specify a startup project for this of Ode to Food, odetofood.cs prod. So that's the startup project, which is my web application. Doing this, .NET EF will be able to generate a script for me that I can copy and place into a file and perhaps hand over to a DBA and say, this is how you create the database. Then all I need is the connection information that I can plug into a configuration file or a configuration source somewhere that allows my application to access that database. But I'm going to take a slightly different approach. The approach I'm going to take is I want to add some code into the application that will automatically execute these migrations against whatever database it's configured to connect to. And if that database doesn't exist, the application will create the database itself. Of course, this will require the application to have access to the database in the DB creator role, which again is not always something that happens in a production environment. You typically try to minimize the privileges available to an application. But since I cannot cover every possible scenario, I'm just trying to show you some of the common approaches to integrating with the database. And then we're going to carry through with this full demo by just enabling an automatic migration feature. The way to do this is to execute migrations when this program is starting up. And the ideal place to do that then would be inside of program.cs here at the entry point before I start running my web server. In other words, I want to separate the steps of building a web host and running the web host into 2 distinct steps. So I have a place in between where I can execute migration. So I'm going to say host equals create web host builder and build that host, and then sometime later do a host.run to start the server process executing. In between, this is where I want to be able to execute migrations against that database. And fortunately, the DB Context and Entity Framework Core provides an API that allows me to execute migrations against a database. It's just going to require a little bit of code. But what I want to do is tuck this away into a separate method, perhaps. So let's say that I want to invoke a method called migrate database. And I know I'm going to need this host object because the host object will give me access to some of the services that I need, like the DB context. And now I can use Visual Studio and control period on this symbol to generate this method for me. So let's now implement this method. In order to migrate a database, I need access to my DB context object. So over in odetofood.data, what I need is access to odetofood DB context. I need a new instance of this class to do the migration. But I cannot just use the new keyword and construct an instance of this class myself because I don't know exactly what DB context options to pass along. All of that has been configured inside of the configure services method of this application. Specifically, what type of database to use. Is it SQL Server or some other database? What is the connection string to use? I want to rely on all that information that is already configured into my application. In other words, I want to effectively resolve a dependency from the service provider that is in ASP.NET Core that is typically used to inject dependencies into things like Razor Pages and controllers that we've seen all throughout this course. And that's not hard to do. The first step is I'm going to add a using statement and grab a hold of something known as a scope. And I can get a scope by going to host.services. So I'm asking my web host about its collection of services, and I want it to create a scope for me. I'll explain what a scope is here in just a moment, but this create scope method It's an extension method in a different namespace, which is Microsoft.extensions.dependency-injection. So I press Control period inside of Visual Studio, and let's bring in a using statement for that namespace. And now I have a scope. A scope ensures that I can grab a service from the service provider and then clean that service up in the appropriate fashion afterwards. Remember, services are registered with a lifetime. So we have singleton services and transient services and HTTP request scoped services. When I get a service, when I get my DB context out of the service provider, I want to make sure it maintains the proper scope, and I can have this using statement and the scope effectively clean up the services that I'm using when I'm done, if they do indeed need some cleanup. So from this scope object, I have an API that will allow me to get to an Ode to Food DB context. And the way I do that is I'm going to store that in a variable called DB, but I go to the scope and I go to the service provider and I say, please get me the required service, so the service that I absolutely need, and that is the Ode to Food DB context. I'm going to need to bring in a namespace for this. It's over in the ode to food.data namespace. So bring that in with Control period. And I now have a fully initialized DB context. I just noticed that I'm missing a semicolon up here. Let me add that so everything compiles correctly. And now that I have a fully initialized DB context that can talk to the database, let's use the API to execute the migrations, which is I go to the database property that represents the database. You can see I can do different things here, like begin a transaction. I can delete the database, but what I want to do is execute a method, again, an extension method named migrate. So I need to use Control period here and bring in a namespace, Microsoft.EntityFramework Core. What this method will do, as the IntelliSense documents, is that it will apply any pending migration for the context to the database, and it will create the database if it does not already exist. So now every time my application starts, if there have been any migrations that have been added to the application, specifically to the data project, which we reference, those migrations will execute as soon as the application starts up. Of course, in a real production environment, you might want to take some additional steps to make sure that your database is backed up before you apply migrations, just in case something goes wrong. But I'm going to leave some of these important details as exercises for the viewer. But now that I have the ability for my application to create the database that I need, all I need to do is allow this application to connect to the proper database.